Chapter 1. I wasn't nervous, let's get that absolutely straight. Excited was the word, perhaps, for I was coming home, and I could see already, despite the darkness and the rain, things both familiar and friendly. The airstrip below, naturally, the plane was pointed for the landing. And off to one side was the railroad, marked by moving, lighted coaches and, farther on, the high arch of the bridge, ablaze now. I could see, very faintly in the distance, the thin memorial tower. Yay boy, I was home. For a week. 7 days. 168 hours. In the same town with Wanda Barrow. Softly the plane touched ground, and even at this point, so near the first discordant note, I had no psychic hint, no warning, no veiled doubt or presentiment. Look, I would say on the phone, this is Sergeant Jeff Mason. Remember? The guy who wants to marry you, honey, remember? I could visualize Wanda at her phone. She was very slim and little, and then I wondered if her answer would be yes, and if there'd be a honeymoon. I faced at last the stern picture as it might and could be, and suddenly I was tense and cold, and the bubbles seemed to burst beneath me as I walked up the ramp into the phone. The woman who answered wasn't Wanda. I got it almost instantly, almost with her first hello. Her voice was husky, strange, and she sounded scared as she said, "Sergeant? Who is this? Not the police?" The wires sang a moment. It was a vicious sound, like bees about to sting. Wanda had a small suite on University Road, near the university, and this woman was very likely her landlady, but, police? My picture of Wanda's quiet street, the quiet house and people turned topsy-turvy. "No. Sergeant in Uncle Sam's army," I said. "Now how about Wanda? Will you please call her?" The woman breathed again. I should say she panted. It sounded like that, too fast, too ragged. "Miss Barrow isn't here," she said. Now what do you suppose flashed through my mind? Wanda had tried to meet me? But with schedules and connections so uncertain I'd warned against this. She should be back, though, soon, by 10 o'clock, the woman went on quickly. She went across the campus just a while ago, to see a Mr. Sadler. And I spoke of omens. Let's say you're young, 26 with freckles and red hair. Let's say you've come from the farmlands, with vitality if not graces, a swimming record and a coaching berth on the credit sheet, but, let's say your girl met a man named Vern Sadler. Nice, huh? This Sadler had everything. He was dark, he was handsome, he had money, it seemed. He had medals and war wounds, for he'd fought against the fascists in Spain. I'd wired, written, phoned Wanda Barrow, don't decide until I get a furlough, and tonight I'd counted on sincerity, I guess, a desperate plea. Wanda would withhold decision, that I knew. She'd promised me faithfully. But she hadn't sat beside her phone, to await my call. She'd gone to see Vern Sadler. There goes my apple cart, I thought, and caught the bus to town. Then I walked up the street, with time to spare. This was October and it was raining, a sorry night, thick with mist and drizzle. There was a drug store on the corner, a few blocks from Wanda's address. I skidded in. I fell. The floor was slippery near the door and the druggist looked at me. You could see what he was thinking. "Nice trip, soldier?" he said. "Some black coffee?" I changed a dime for nickels. I marched back to the phone booth. Everybody had cell phones but me, and public phones were too hard to come by. By now Wanda surely would be home, and she'd say, "Hello, Jeff, where are you?" She'd be kind at least. She always had been. But it was the woman who answered again. "Sergeant, it's 10:15, she said. Her voice had a new, high, queer ring. "She's like my own daughter," she said. I told her not to walk across the campus. Wanda had walked across the campus, the woman puzzled me. I thanked her, hung up, but why wouldn't Wanda take the campus shortcut? We always had, in days gone by, the evenings we had spent with our good friend Hillary Crane. I sat at the fountain while and got to talking with the druggist. He knew Vern Sadler. He was at the bottom of a V, 2 streets met, V-like, at this store, this corner. Up one, University Road, lived Wanda. Up the other, Fearing Drive, lived Sadler. So this druggist knew both Sadler and Wanda, and he said abruptly. She must have been crazy, though, to cut across the campus. I frowned. Then I held up 2 fingers. The top of the V, see? She's sensible. Well anyway, he said. I hope nothing has happened to her. I looked at him. What the devil did he mean? Live around here 10 years ago, soldier? No, I said, taut and cold inside suddenly. That time it was a kid, a killing. Why, I helped patrol the streets myself, night after night for 2 weeks. I had 2 children of my own, you know. He produced a newspaper and pointed to a word splashed across its front page. Mugger. 3 times now in the last couple of weeks, he said. Always happens in this neighborhood. Soldier, there's a screwball loose. He waylays people, he cracks 'em on the head. You mark my words, it's going to end in another murder. I got off the counter stool. Not Wanda, I thought. This druggist, his head was cocked to one side as he frowned and regarded me. Not Wanda, I thought. I walked back to the phone, and this time the woman was sobbing. Wanda promised, she said. And she always keeps her word. 10 o'clock, she said, I'm sure of it. There was a clicking sound, the woman's teeth. I replaced the receiver. Then I took a deep breath and paged the book and called Sadler. Curiously, Mr. Sadler was not at home. I know. You'll say this girl, Wanda Barrow, was going to write me off her list anyway, so she breaks a date with me, to keep one with the man it's plain she's going to marry. You'll say she went somewhere with Vern Sadler. But you don't know Wanda. She's a funny kid. I mean, swell. Say, you're going to meet her at a place downtown. You don't stand around a lobby or a corner. The clock strikes and she's there. Her word is like Greenwich, like money in the bank. So I knew this was serious and that something might well have happened to her. I walked rapidly up the right side of the V, Sadler's side, up Fearing Drive. Sadler lived in an apartment building, rambling Briarhill sandstone set well back in a lawn full of trees. There was a circle drive. And this was high ground, and by day you could look back and see far across the valley. You could see, first, just across the street, the fine old home of Professor Hilary Crane, red brick with white trim, and a high wall all around it. And then, off down the gentle slope, the university. Between Crane's home and the university buildings was the campus, the woods and a sparkle of blue, the lagoon. I walked up Sadler's Drive, and the entrance was very swanky. A canopy, soft lights, a blonde at the switchboard. She disapproved of my wet, wrinkled uniform. She frowned as I leaned on her desk. I'm sorry. Mr. Sadler is out, she said. He left about an hour ago. That long? I frowned. Wasn't that approximately the time Wanda would have been coming to call upon him? You mean with the girl? What girl? The switchboard operator said. It was warm in the tight little lobby. I shivered. But a girl came in to see him this evening. Maybe you know her, little, blonde, a Miss Barrow? She just looked at me. I wet my lips. No girl? Sorry, soldier. Okay, I said. It's okay. An hour lost. The tree-lined drive seemed strange now and foreboding. A car turned and its lights revealed the dripping branches. Tears clinging to the crooked bare limbs, I thought. Then I crossed the street, past Crane's high wall, and here, once off the street and in the puddled lane, I ran. Wanda? I called, to empty darkness, but had I thought she'd answer? 100 times we'd walked this lane together. From Wanda's house to Crane's, where, until Vern Sadler came upon the scene, we would spend occasional evenings pleasantly. There was the time we'd paused here, on the high bald hill, the knob, just to stand in awe before the beauty of the valley. And sometimes we would veer off toward the woods, the spring, though never quite so far as the lagoon at night. Wanda. I called. Tonight the darkness taunted me. 9 years ago, one day, I'd walked to the lagoon. I'd walked softly through the woods, alone that time, and come upon a boy, a dumpy fellow with unruly hair and wearing a sweater much too small for him. He had a stick under one arm and a crust of bread in one hand. There were ducks in the lagoon, and he was unaware of my presence and crooning to the ducks. He was giggling and feeding crumbs to the ducks when they swam ashore and waddled up the bank to him. Oh my God, I thought, don't let it happen like that with Wanda. The ducks had waddled ashore and the boy had rewarded their trust with sudden shrill yells, and when they ran, quacking their terror, he'd swung with his stick and he'd laughed and he'd hit them. The path made a sharp turn. I skidded and fell, full in the mud, in a puddle. And then I saw the glow of a light off ahead, a small yellow ray that wavered and went out again instantly. I heard footsteps and a figure was looming, a blot in the night. It slowed, stiffened, paused warily. "Who is there?" A voice, cold and precise, called. I rose as the light flashed upon me. "Jeff Mason." The man gasped. It was Professor Hilary Crane. I knew his voice from the years of our friendship. I knew his habits. The lights often burned long at Crane's Madhouse, the lab in Hilary Crane's Department of Psychology. And strange cries came from the madhouse at night. And then, very late, the lights would go out, and Crane would emerge, tall, gray and lonely, to tramp to the red-walled red brick house across the campus. He was an international figure, perhaps best known for his endocrine theory, the glands with relation to psychopathology, and for his radical experiments with apes. So it was he, not I, who had more than a right to surprise. He hadn't known I was home. He surely had no expectation of coming upon me in the night like this, crouched and wet and covered with mud. Yet, curiously, he seemed much more startled than surprised. "She's all right," he said at once. "She's alive." I echoed the word, grasped at his arm. "Crane," I cried, "what happened?" "Coming home, I found her," he said. "She was lying near here, near the spring." "Unconscious? From a blow?" "Yes, Jeff." The scene flashed through my mind, the earlier, horrible scene. Wanda, slim and walking swiftly. Wanda unaware that she was watched, and stalked. I could feel her first sharp fear, and see her as she whirled, and then as she, no doubt, stood paralyzed. She'd screamed. The ducks quacked, and they ran, and he took his stick and hit them. Still I held to Crane's arm. "The mugger?" I said. "Come with me." Crane's voice was quiet and kind. There was strength in it and reassurance, for Crane himself had known tragedy, and Crane knew the dangers rising out of fear. "That's what it was, sir, the mugger?" I said. We started up the path. I heard sirens and, far off below, I saw the slash of spotlights. Then other white eyes, cars bold with their number, raced crisscross on dark narrow streets, all with one goal, the campus. "But where is Wanda now, F?" "The hospital," Crane said gently. "I carried her, Jeff, and she came to promptly. She was conscious when we got there. Very likely they'll permit you to see her at the hospital first thing in the morning. So she's quite all right, Jeff, except..." He turned his flashlight off, here on the wider path, on firmer ground. "Except," he repeated after a deep breath, "the night and what happened is a blank to her." Chapter 2. We came to Crane's high wall, and Crane's man Varco was at the locked side gate to let us in. I shivered when I saw again this great dark figure. But then Varco had startled even so cosmopolitan a town as University City when Crane brought him back from Spain. That was years ago, my second year at the university. And Crane's return had been as abrupt and strange as when he'd resigned and gone away. Tongues wagged both times, of course. Except for Franco and Spain's civil war, it was conceded he might well have remained in that country. He'd made many new friends over there. Vern Sadler, who came to University City much later, was one of them. But one day Crane returned abruptly to us. His son, who had been ailing when he left, was dead, he said. A widower, he was a very lonely man from this time on. He built a wall around himself, as indeed he built the high red wall around his home. He lived with only Varco, the Moor, the giant of a man, the deaf mute with a pocked face who looked like one of Ali Baba's 40 thieves. And save for his classes and the work he resumed at his madhouse, save for the very few of us who were welcome at his home, no one really knew him. Now, Varco held a small dim lantern. And Varco's white teeth and a nod were his greeting to me. We walked a sheltered path, past dripping shrubbery, to a side door, to a small room, the library. But I could see the great baronial hall, the fireplace so large an ox could have been roasted in it. I could see the high hot flame, and a poker lying off alongside, a giant's tool, worthy of that mass of stone, and of men like Crane, and Varco. Crane tossed his hat and raincoat aside. "Will you be in town long?" "A week, sir." "Where are you staying?" I mentioned a hotel, though as yet I hadn't registered. "Nonsense. I've plenty of room. It's quiet here. The walls have all been," he hesitated, then added, "soundproofed." I thanked him, but of course I couldn't stay with Crane. At any rate, you'll want to wash up a bit, he said. He led me across the hall, to a lavatory, and from there, its door ajar, I heard him run up the steps, and Varco ran up the stairs also. It was at least 20 minutes before they returned. Crane walked as with a great weight. He was gray, as I've said, and his face was lined and thin tonight and tired. But he came on to the library, smiling at me. "You're still a mess," he said. He referred to the mud on my uniform. I grinned at him. He saw that I was searching my pockets. "Lose anything?" he said. I admitted. "My pen. Apparently just before we met, when I fell. But it's of no consequence, sir. I'm really worried about Wanda, this loss of memory." "Is it serious?" Crane was making himself comfortable. "No, I hardly think so. X-rays were taken and I had a quick look, and happily the parietal bone was not fractured. She may experience headaches, dizziness, irritability, some of the minor symptoms, but amnesia itself too certainly not unexpected following a blow like that. But quite frankly, I'm not convinced the amnesia results from trauma. I'm inclined to call Wanda's loss of memory psychic hysteric, the result of some terrible shock." I sat down. A moment passed. "Difficult to relieve, sir?" I said. "No." There was a bottle and glasses before him, and Crane was pouring wine now. "I think she'll be all right. The treatment will be essentially psychoanalytic, and I intend to begin treatment as quickly as she is released from the hospital. Tomorrow, very likely. No, you've nothing to worry about. She'll be all right." I considered this, sighed and said then, "I wonder what happened to Sadler?" Crane stiffened. "Eh?" Drop of wine spilled on the rug as he turned to me sharply. "Vern?" "Yes, I take it he knew Wanda was coming to see him." Crane interrupted, and his voice surprised me, its harshness. "What are you talking about?" "Why, she was coming to see him tonight," I said. "So wouldn't you say she had phoned him first, to be sure he was home? Or perhaps, he'd called and invited her over? Anyway, she never got to his place. I checked. And that makes it appear rather strange, don't you think, that he left?" Again Crane interrupted. "To look for her? Well, that's the obvious interpretation, isn't it?" Crane was muttering under his breath. He indicated the wine, that I was to serve myself, and crossed to his desk and picked up the phone. The number he called was Sadler's, and it was a man who answered, but not Sadler. I would have known Sadler's smooth voice anywhere. This voice was deep and anything but smooth, and Crane finally called the man. "Hayne." They had a one-sided conversation, with Crane saying "yes," tensely, several times. Then he put down the phone and I noticed that his face was white, that his hands were shaking. I noticed that now he looked at me queerly. He turned back to his chair and his silence persisted until I couldn't help but say, "Well, sir? Sadler isn't home?" Crane opened a small teak casket. He took a cigarette, lit it. "Jeff, we've been friends a good many years." Something had happened to him. I could hear it in his voice, in every word. See it in every small gesture and in every taut line of his body. He continued. "I've known no love has been lost between you and Sadler, but Jeff, did you hate him?" "Hate?" I sipped of the wine, frowning and cautious. "No, that's not the word. Aren't you putting me in a bit of a spot? He's your friend." "I know." Crane made a nervous motion, raised his wrist to look at his watch. "Please be honest with me." "Well, I know I never trusted him. I think I feared him, sir, really. And of course you know why. I didn't want to lose Wanda." "Were you about to lose her, Jeff? Is that why you came home?" Still I sipped, and I could feel a tick-tock within me, my heart quickening, beginning to pound. "Yes," I said. "Frankly, I'm afraid that was going to be her answer tonight." "Sadler's dead, Cliff," Crane said. I just looked at him. And at last he glanced down, at his glass, and lifted it and set it aside again. "The police are there now, at his suite. Hayne is homicide inspector." "Murdered?" I whispered the word. "Got Vern Sadler," Hayne said that to me, Jeff, on the phone, and it happened, presumably, as you guessed, when Sadler went to search for Wanda. Hayne said, "And this time we've got the mugger." Crane paused. I wanted to shout, "Hurry, man, what is the rest of it?" For I knew there was more. And I knew by his tautness, his whiteness and this delay, that it concerned me. Hurry, Matt, what is the rest of it? But perversely I said. Yes, I was afraid something had happened to him. His disability handicapped him, of course. He could scarcely have escaped by running. I couldn't go on. My lips were dry, my throat dry and aching. Crane sighed. And Haynes said, Jeff, we found a fountain pen near the spring, not 10 feet from the body. My breath caught. A pen? With J. Mason imprinted on it, Jeff. But A gong began ringing. Loudly. Wildly, it seemed. The gong reverberated in my mind. There was a quick soft pit-pat of slippered feet in the hall, and Varco flashed past the open library door. But I can't possibly be the mugger, I cried. Anyone can see that, sir. Until tonight I've been on the coast, in the army. Crane shook his head. You're confused. You're not thinking clearly. It's wholly obvious you had opportunity, they've discovered what would seem to be strong circumstantial evidence of that. So what more is needed to get a murder conviction? Motive, and that's already established. You certainly had reason to hate and therefore to eliminate Sadler. But surely you don't believe this? That I killed him? That it was my intention to make the murder look like the mugger's work? Me? Crane said again. The cords were tight in his neck. His neck? Now I saw myself as others had seen me tonight. The druggist, the switchboard operator, yes, even Hillary Crane. The evening spun through my mind, each little incident like threads in a shroud. And the front door was opening, I heard it squealing on its hinges. The same deep voice I'd heard talking to Crane over the phone began speaking to Varco. Then Crane picked up his glass again. His hand clamped hard on it. The slender, fragile thing broke. He looked at his hand, the red wine like blood on it. Get out, he said harshly. The side door, while there is still time. Oh, outside in the darkness, in the deep shadows of shrubbery and Crane's wall, the phrase clung to my mind, bothered me. Still time? For what? Well, boys, I could say to Haynes' men, I'm the man you're looking for. I'm Jeff Mason. But murder? That's all a mistake. I was searching for Wanda and for Sadler when. How about it, Jeff Mason, I thought. I walked slowly toward the street, my blood pounding. Sure, I'd be pushed around. For a few days I would live in hell, perhaps, but the police would surely turn up real clues and clear me by that time. Well, wouldn't they? Wouldn't they? Read about the guy who served 26 years in the pen, in Michigan. He was innocent, too. He believed, too, that justice would prevail, and it did, after 26 years. Break it up, boys, I heard a voice say, and then I saw the cars, the people. Kids, at this ungodly hour. Women who'd come running with their babies. Men calling loudly. Still time. I turned around, walked toward the knob. Two silhouettes appeared, coming from the campus. I swerved, ran toward the spring, but there were lights by the spring, of course, the men of Haynes' technical squad. I slipped aside, into the woods and, after running miles it seemed, threw myself flat on the ground. Well, this is it, isn't it? Wanda's landlady, the druggist, the switchboard operator, they'll all testify. Even Crane, and how will their testimony sound? You're going to take a whipping, kid, if you don't hide out. Later, I found the corporal's cottage, the white one on the high bank of the river. It was a quiet place. Yet here the darkness taunted me, bred fancies and ideas. Cars were turning off the highway? There was someone outside, walking in the wet grass? Whatever my exhaustion, I couldn't sleep. I began to wonder about Wanda. Suppose Crane had been wrong? Suppose Wanda would become worse through the night? I knew I couldn't help, or call her. With dawn, a plan formed in my mind. Perhaps it was the gun, the .45 I found with the light of morning. The corporal's gun. Somehow the gun gave me new strength. When it was night again I dressed in the corporal's civvies and drove his car to town. The plan was, simply, to contact the mugger's earlier victims. The names of the first two were Jones, a man of middle age, and a girl, a Miss Calkins. I got the names and addresses from the newspapers. Jones had lost only a wrist watch, despite that he'd carried considerable cash. And from Miss Calkins only a gold compact had been taken. Max Hunter, the third victim, Was made of different stuff, however. He was cagey. He didn't answer the door, so I had contacted him by phone. "I can't talk," he said. His voice cracked and rasped at me. "I should run off my lip and get in a jam?" I said. "Look, Mr. Hunter. Who are you anyway?" "Look," I said, "all I want to know is what was taken from you." He grumbled. His throat sounded froggy. He cleared it. "A lodge button." "A lodge button?" My mind spun. "From your coat lapel? Who the devil are you?" "Look," I said. "According to the papers, you were walking home and you'd turned off Fearing Drive." "Yeah, on the cross street, on what do you call it?" "And stepped from behind a tree." "Are you sure he didn't drop out of the tree, in front of you?" There was a short period of silence. I said, "Mr. Hunter?" And his voice came at last. "I ran. I got conked and that's all there is to it." The receiver clicked in my ear. Then I called Crane, but Crane didn't answer the phone himself. Instead, "Jeff," I heard, almost a whisper, "this is Wanda." She'd been discharged from the hospital at noon, and now we rode north on the drive, Wanda and I, and the pickup had been easy. We'd set the time, and Wanda walked the block from Crane's to a dark corner. She wore fur tonight, and she was blonde and beautiful and pale. I turned on the light to look at her. "Keep going," she said. "Way out." "You're all right?" "Yes." I breathed again. "But there's another question. Do you believe in me?" She said simply, "Isn't it clear? I'm here." The car swayed half across the road. One other night we'd driven like this, under strain _63 in tension. And that night, "Jeff," she'd said, "Vern Sadler's going to stay in town. He's going to live here." "With Crane?" I'd said, trying to sound casual. Sadler had been Crane's house guest at the time. Sadler had but arrived in University City. And from that night on Wanda had, well, she'd seemed doubtful. From that night on Vern Sadler had become a threat to me. Wanda stirred now. "Jeff, part of it's clear. I called Vern last night. I phoned him a little before 9 and asked him to come over." "Oh, a party for me? Company when I got there?" She ignored it. "But he couldn't come," she said. "He'd had the doctor just last evening, for his leg again, the old wounds. Jeff, you know how hard walking was with him, so I tried to get a cab, but it was raining and I'd have had to wait." Was seeing Sadler so important? I broke. Her voice, when it came, was low. "I'd decided," she said. "I felt I had to see him before you got home. I wasn't going to marry him." I caught my breath. But we'd come to a bridge, a curve. A truck was passing several cars and coming toward us. By the time Dye Road was clear again, Wanda was saying, "So I started across the campus, and it ends there, Jeff. It ends there." Suddenly she was trembling and close to me, her face pressed against my shoulder. "I don't know what happened, Jeff, none of it." I found her hand, held it. I tried to think of all I'd meant to say last night. But last night was gone. I pressed her hand and said, "What does Crane say?" She'd gone to Crane tonight, of course, that he might help her with her memory. She didn't answer. "Han?" she said at last, in a small frightened voice. "Jeff, he wants to believe as I do. He thinks that you witnessed the murder, and that this psychic block prevails now because you can't, due to your love, face the situation." She didn't answer. "Did you see me?" I said. "I don't know." "You do know. Being alone with me tonight proves you do, subconsciously. Crane must see that." She whispered, "I love you, and nothing else matters." We drove a while, and I was humble now. I talked, nothing important, but each word chosen carefully, with purpose. "Han, lean back," I said when new miles were behind us. "Put your head on the back of the seat. Does your head hurt?" "A little," a dull throb. "Then close your eyes. Relax. It's calm now, and we're safe now. Are you sleepy?" I could be." "Motor. Sounds good. Like it?" "It's smooth. It sounds like rain." "Rain?" "The rhythm. The smoothness. Hear the brakes in the pavement, darling? Like footsteps in the rain?" "No," she said. I tightened my grip on the wheel. But you're walking in the rain, in the night like this, swiftly. Swiftly? She said. Yes, toward the knob, remember the knob? Where we stood to look out across the valley. Yes, the knob. Once there was moonlight shining, but last night it rained. The rain became excited and whispered, and then he came over the knob. I paused, not daring to breathe. Her answer, long in coming, exploded. No. No, he came from the spring. The spring? My heart skipped a beat. The trees? Yes, dark like a tree and big? Jeff, she said. I looked straight ahead, at the white ribbon of road. The rain, the night was afraid as he spoke to you. No. No, he made sounds. Chattering? No. Snarling? No. Like a dog might make, a whimper? Yes. And you stood frozen. She was panting, and she'd clutched at my arm, but I continued inexorably. Then the seconds ticked off and away, like the raindrops ticking away, until suddenly. He took a step. Toward you? Yes? Did you see him, his face? 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 It was night, it was dark. Harry? I whirled. Did you run? She breathed. Oh my God. I stopped the car. I took her in my arms. I kissed her, and time passed and still we sat like that, close, until I'd stilled her trembling. Then I said. There's something more. Don't bring it back, she pleaded. Something's still missing, I said. How? Something you had last night and haven't got now. 10 seconds. 20. She gasped. Her hand flew to her throat. My pin? I wondered today where I'd lost it. You wore it last night? You're sure? Yes, Jeff, I'm sure. Then listen. One more question. Judging from the size of the man and the sounds. You mean could it have been Varco? She whispered. I started the car. I turned on the radio. And the mugger came suddenly over the radio, the tail end of a newscast, struck again tonight, but in a different section, far across town. The latest victim, strangely enough, was again a man named Maxie Hunter. Chapter 3. So lightning never strikes twice. And yet this seemed too pat and too much. Max Hunter again, twice, in this city of thousands. I drove Wanda back to town, and my conviction grew that the pattern was no longer insanely rational, as it had been. This second attack on Hunter was wrong. But I couldn't get to Hunter tonight to test Hunter tonight and, depending upon how badly he was injured this time, perhaps not for several nights. However, would he be badly injured this time? I returned, finally, to the corporal's cottage, and with every hour now I knew I had to see Maxie Hunter, the kind of man he was. Little dark eyes? Shifty? Yes, I had to meet Max Hunter. But the police were parked a block from his house when, in the darkness of the next evening, I drove up. I drove on. I rode around a while and then tried again. Hayne was no fool. Hayne had seen Hunter, and apparently the squad car was parked there to stay and watch him. So I cut across town and got on a drugstore phone. Mr. Hunter said. Hello. Mr. Hunter, recognizing my voice, was anything but surly tonight. You take it one time in Frisco, he said, hi, running words together, talking very swiftly. All I did was walk under a sign. The damn thing just went and fell down on me. Or you take it once I lit a cigarette. Now, pal, you light a cigarette and nothing ever happens to you, but with me, some damn fool went and turned the gas on in the house. I got no sense of smell. You see? Up she went, the whole caboodle. Mr. Max Hunter said, with scarcely a pause. Things always happen to me. 3 years ago I was mugged in St. Louis. Yes sir, lost $800. Mr. Hunter was talking too much. Did you lose anything last night? I interrupted. Last night? It seemed he turned aside. I could hear him breathing. Last night I was lucky, pal. You weren't even injured badly? Nope, I was pretty lucky, pal. And nothing was taken? That's right, not last night. I could hear him breathing. You see, I got me a girl, he was saying. She's young. She's just a kid. She lives on the south side, you see? Well, I always meet her down the street, by the alley, on account I was married once and ain't got a divorce, and her pappy gets tough when you men. I could hear the breathing even while he talked. So it wasn't Hunter's breathing. He wasn't alone. Hunter, listen, you stood by the alley, waiting? You faced the street, and the mugger came up behind you? Sure, he. Did you hear him? See him? Now, you know, he said. It's a funny thing. I never. So this time you didn't run? What's the matter? He said. Here I am, telling you, ain't I, that I'm just standing by the alley. I slammed up the receiver. The booth door stuck. I heard a siren when finally I got it open. By the time I'd crossed the floor and reached the street door, a second siren wailed. One from the north, one from the south, 2 police cars converging and both near. I ran for my car. The traffic light was red. I cut it and turned east, down the side street. Split seconds later the squad cars climbed the curb at the drugstore. By the skin of my teeth. My teeth were chattering. Now Haynes' men were near, very near, and sure soon to find and corner me. This race was run, but won? The radio was on, played on. I heard only the sad notes. For a little while I rode the dark streets aimlessly. By now Wanda had gone back to Crane's house, to wait again for me as we had arranged. By now she would be worried, wondering what had happened. I could see her in my mind, her restlessness. And I could almost feel the tension there, beneath the snug warmth of Crane's library. I could see Crane in this visualized scene, his tired face, his tired eyes, then the slippered feet of Varco walked into my thoughts and stayed. I rode aimlessly, and yet I knew these streets. I knew each turn I made now brought the issue nearer. The .45 automatic lay heavy in my pocket, and I touched it, but with a queer aversion. And presently I came to Fearing Drive, and the evening had grown thin. These were dark areas that I passed, houses locked, asleep. All but Crane's. His lights burned bravely as I drove past, tense, attuned to danger. It was a glint in the shadows of a driveway that warned me. My headlights had found, however briefly, grille work, chrome, a hidden car, and that meant Hayne again. What do you call it? Hunter's name for the side street. It dipped and bridged the shallow stream, it twisted near the woods and narrowed to a lane. I parked the car and cut, on foot, into the darkness. Crane's wall, the back gate, was my goal now. And here the trees stood high and the wind moaned through naked branches. And here the woods began to thin to meet the campus. A rustic footbridge spanned the small lagoon. I crossed it, and now I could hear the bubble of the spring, its fuss and urgency. The night listened briefly with me, empty, inky. The farther slope, the crooked path, led past the spot where Sadler's body had been found. I paused and shivered, and I could see the shadows of the university buildings, far down. I could see the lonely outline of Crane's madhouse, silent at this distance, brooding in the night. Still I paused, disturbed. I felt a tingling at my spine, a vague awareness. It was a small scratching sound that came first. A rabbit? A small scampering creature? I waited, and then the sound came again, and this time I knew it. Padded feet on gravel. I pulled the gun from my pocket. The scratching was still off and up and away, from the knob that stood bold in the wan moonlight. But the knob, queerly, was barren. Of course I looked for the tall frame, the figure enormous, and drew in a quick breath when finally I saw approaching me something crawling on all fours. The sound was fingers scratching at loose stone. Fingers hunting for something, long lost. A gold pin, perhaps, from Wanda's blouse. I listened and watched as the thing crawled ever closer, and audible now was its breathing, ragged as with rage and frustration. Suddenly, deliberately, I moved. The blot stiffened, shot up to both knees. The moon behind it revealed hanging arms and strong sloping shoulders. The moonlight revealed a figure as from other ages, long removed. Then its breathing stopped as it saw me. It rose. Seconds passed as it swayed on the path, and it was truly enormous. Then the cries came, the cries Jones had heard, and Miss Calkins and Wanda, the whimpering sounds they had described to me, but with one sharp difference. The weird voice was gleeful, and it crooned. A few yards only separated us now. It took a step toward me, one arm upraised, a stone clutched in pronged fingers. I didn't shout or spin or run or press the trigger of the gun. The wordless yells came and rose and wavered. Drop that stone, I said. Drop that stick, I'd said that day at the lagoon. Years ago. And the boy with the unruly hair, the thick arms and the sweater too small for him, the curious creature who had crooned invitation to the ducks only to hit them, sobbed that day. He dropped his stick that day, to stand before me bewildered and trembling. Drop that stone, I said, and he trembled and the stone fell at last, and he sobbed. We met Crane at the rear gate. He took the docile hand from mine and led the way through the garden. We came in by the side door, and Wanda stood in the library doorway. She was staring at us. Jeff, she said. I went to her, held her in my arms. But Crane stayed on in the great hall, by the fire. He moved a chair, for warmth. Then he took the giant's poker and raised a giant flame. And his voice came to us softly. A soothing, a kind, a sad voice. He spoke as to a small child. Jeff, he told me, Wanda began faintly. His son escaped tonight again, and he told me. He knew it was criminal to keep silent longer. I didn't speak, and she continued. Varco is still out, searching. The police, their guns, that was Crane's deadly fear, that the look out of the window. Is it raining? If it isn't, remember that someday it will police would have to shoot. But now it's all over, she said. Her hand tightened on my arm as Crane came in. I suppose the day of reckoning had to come, sometime, he said. His face was utterly white. I've tried in every way to postpone it since the boy was a child. I'd planned to say. It was common knowledge there was something wrong with your son, and once you said he had died in Spain. Yet when you returned, you soundproofed the house. You built a wall around it, and you brought with you Varco, only too obviously a guard. The truth, Crane, was there, had anyone cared to see and read it. But I didn't speak, for Crane seemed to have aged and lost his strength, and his anguish was naked and terrible as he stood nodding, dumb before this tragedy and seeing scenes far off. A man of fame, and proud, the pain of such a child. A man who'd fought with science for a cure and failed. Now he saw back through the years and found them desolate and empty. He sighed at length and said. A child was murdered, years ago, a murder the police never solved. But one day a long time after that killing I discovered my son playing with a trinket, a ring. It was the ring the murdered child had worn, so then I knew. I knew my boy must never be free again. But I knew, too, I could not let the world know of this crack in my armor. Crack in his armor? I frowned, puzzled that he should speak thus of something so beyond him. Crack in his armor? His pride, he meant, his failure to himself and science? But though he'd paused to take a deep breath, he continued. So I went abroad. Escape, Jeff, that's what I'd wanted. I didn't speak. I couldn't. And still, from outside the library, the hall, we heard small giggling sounds, and I caught a flash view of the monster, Crane's son, over Crane's shoulder. I saw him with the poker in his meaty hand, and he was chopping at the fireplace, at charred logs, at the wink and leap of flame. Trinkets fascinated him. Crane's voice came now as from a deep preoccupation. These recent attacks, that's all he wanted, Jeff, trinkets. At first I refused to read of the muggings. I refused to believe he'd broken out, or see how that was possible. Then, tonight, shortly after Wanda arrived, we found his empty room, and we found his pitiful hoard, a compact, a wristwatch, a lodge button. Not Wanda's pin? He'd returned tonight to the spring, to paw the ground and hunt for Wanda's pin? This was a thought aside. My conscious mind still failed to find solutions quite so easily. Yet, I had to speak, my voice sounded cold and brutal to me. I felt ill. What about Sadler? I said. Crane looked at me. And the mugging last night, on the south side of town? I reached for a cigarette, my fingers trembling. The pack dropped. I picked it up. That's a loose end too, Crane? Still he looked at me. I struck a match and the flame danced as I inhaled. For one thing, your son couldn't possibly have crossed the city. So we must assume that attack wasn't made by the mugger, as we know him. Well, what then? Was it front, camouflage, designed to draw attention away from this, the vital area? There was a pocket lighter lying on the desk. Crane picked it up, snapped it, tossed it down again. Don't forget the long arm of coincidence, Crane said. I'm not forgetting coincidence. That Hunter was twice victim was very likely coincidental. I admit that, and explain it away as one of life's imponderables. But is Hunter, the victim, important? Crane, I'm concerned with motive now, and method. Robbery wasn't the motive, not in the second mugging of Hunter, for nothing was taken. Thus the pattern varied, and so too, curiously, did the method of attack, and that is where you twice made a terrible mistake, Crane. Wanda gasped and tugged at my arm, her Lee, I think. Yes, Hillary Crane was dear to her, as he'd always been to me. But the bridges were burned. I couldn't turn back, or stop. Sadler couldn't run, I said. The crackle of flame came suddenly, loudly, from the great fireplace. Crane's gaze was locked with mine. His eyes first turned away. What do you mean, Jeff? He asked then in a flat, tired voice. That Sadler's murder and the second attack on Hunter were planned to cover the first 4 assaults. That your son was admittedly, morbidly, attracted by light, glitter, trinkets, and one other thing, Crane, you didn't mention. Movement. He never struck until the victim ran. Hunter didn't run, the second time. Sadler couldn't run. His leg, the old wounds, precluded it. Therefore your son didn't mug Hunter the second time. And your son didn't kill Vern Sadler. Isn't it significant, Crane, that Sadler was with you in Spain? And conceivable he knew why you went to Spain? Certainly he knew your son had not died over there. So Sadler came to visit you in University City, and he stayed, a leech, I suspect, only too aware of your fear that the world would learn of your son and what he had done. Sadler, with no visible means of support, lived in luxury. Well, what was it, Crane, blackmail? I say he knew what had happened 2 nights ago, when Wanda failed to arrive at his suite. I say he crossed the street that night and came to you. He was less concerned with Wanda than with opportunity. He wanted to marry Wanda and he wanted more money, and the 2 of you went out to search for the mugger, and Wanda. And there was your opportunity. Finally, you were determined your son would never again escape. You believed the pressure could be cleverly removed from this area if you attacked someone far off, across town. You knew no one would question your alibi of having been at work the night of Sadler's death, or last night at the hour of the Hunter attack. Crane, you killed Vern Sadler. The gongs began ringing, the great clashing sound so peculiar to Crane's house. When he said, "That's Varco. Please wait. I must let him in," I was certain Crane would go quietly only to the side gate. I blame myself for what happened. True, Crane was a brilliant man. It is fantastic to believe he could have missed the smallest psychological clue. Although tension and fear can blind the mind of anyone. Yet, I should have mentioned the ducks, the stories Jones, Hunter, Miss Culkins told. I should have recalled all these things to Crane's mind and thus made the thing plain. And so I blame myself, and still. But there is even yet another and a happy explanation. His utter failure might have brought this brief disorganization. Then the ringing gongs, the mad reverberation, I cannot believe he planned it. For Crane turned from us. He ran. Crane, I called after him. It was already too late to stop him. We heard the bellow, the savage roar, the glee. Wanda was clinging to me, screaming, and I pushed her back. I tried to shut the door, to shut her in. There was no time. There were split seconds only if Crane were to be saved, for already that giant's tool, the poker, was swinging in the giant's hand. I don't remember pulling my gun, but I had to pull the trigger. What else could I do? The gun kicked hard there in my hand, and Crane stumbled. He fell, and for a breathless moment I thought the bullet had not saved him. Then I saw him reach up to his shoulder. The poker had missed his head. One bullet. There was no sound from Crane's son, no movement. He lay on the floor, and the giggle was gone now, forever. I called to Crane. He stared at the body. He didn't hear me. And suddenly I became aware that the ringing of the gongs had long since ceased, and somehow Varco had got in. He passed Crane softly, and tears ran down his pocked cheeks unchecked. Gently he picked up the body. I touched Crane's arm. I led Crane back into the library, to his desk. Remember words that he'd used? A crack in his armor? The gold cigarette lighter lay there on his desk, and his hand began at once to inch toward it, furtively. It was very strange. He hugged the lighter. He turned the lighter over, feeling of it he began to giggle, nervously.